Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Kaylin Nicholson.
And I'm Kshama Sawant. We are now just under 3 months away from the August Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where it's expected there will be huge protests, and just about 5 months away from the presidential elections. The election features Biden and Trump as two wildly unpopular candidates, both at dramatically low levels of support rarely seen in US history. Trump is a deeply reactionary figure who has vowed to go after oppressed groups, including LGBTQ people and immigrants, and who already is responsible for the biggest attacks on abortion rights in over half a century, including the overturning of Roe. On the other side, Biden has completely failed working people, continuing Trump's anti-immigrant policies, vowing now to shut down the border. He blocked the strike of railroad workers and betrayed working people, even in his limited promises for a $15 an hour minimum wage and a public health care option. Meanwhile, he attacked and reversed most of the social safety net policies passed during COVID. A significant part of the increased support for Trump has come from the strong feeling of many working and middle-class people that they are worse off than they were 4 years ago. Results from the latest Reuters Ipsos tracking poll released at the end of last month shows Biden's approval rating at 36%, its lowest levels in almost 2 years, amid growing economic pessimism and declining support among key constituencies.
Among Black voters, CNN polling showed Trump at 22%, unusually high for a Republican candidate. And at the same time, support among Black voters for Biden has declined from 81% in 2020 to just 69% now. Still a majority, but a huge decline. Biden's approval is even lower among Black voters under 30 at 55%, and when you include all voters under 30, it drops to a mere 26%. These and other traditionally solid Democratic groups are increasingly turning against Biden as they reel from the cost of living crisis. According to the Reuters poll, Americans prefer Trump's economic policies to Biden's by a 10-point margin. Of course, in reality, Trump is no friend to working people, but the fact that COVID relief was provided under Trump and taken away by Biden has understandably impacted voters' views. Part of the COVID relief package was the child tax credit, which made a major dent in the poverty rate for families with children. The genocidal war on Gaza has also driven millions of young people, Muslim Americans, and other working-class people away from Biden. This bloody assault on the people of Gaza and decades-long brutal occupation would not have been possible were it not for the steadfast financial and political support from Biden and both parties of U.S. imperialism. Biden has sent billions of dollars in military aid for this horrific war. This has alienated him from those opposing the war, who, while they also despise Trump, don't want to vote for the Warmonger-In-Chief.
Today's episode is about what the labor movement should do in relation to Biden and Trump this year. And we are joined by Joe Segru, a music teacher in the Seattle area, a rank-and-file member of the North Shore Education Association, a member of Workers Strike Back, and a former guest on this show. Joe is also part of the music team that composed the theme music for this broadcast. Union endorsements are being coveted by both Biden and Trump as they head into an election that is too close to call and in which every single factor could tip the scales one way or another, especially in relatively union-dense swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters Union, which represents 1.3 million members in sectors including packaging, trucking, manufacturing, and logistics, had a private meeting in January with Donald Trump. This was met with anger from many progressive rank-and-file Teamsters. For example, Richard Hooker Jr., the secretary-treasurer of the Teamsters Local 623 and vice president of the Philadelphia AFL-CIO board, has been quoted in The Guardian as saying, quote, "As leaders, we have to do a better job of explaining to our members that a vote for Trump is a vote against your pension. A vote for Trump is a vote against organizing workers. A vote for Trump is another vote against the working class," end quote. Jess Lister, a shop steward in Georgia and a member of the Teamsters LGBTQ caucus, who has helped lead a campaign to organize part-time UPS workers, called the meeting a slap in the face. She further said, quote, "He has a long-standing history of racism, of hate towards women, towards minorities, towards the LGBTQ community, our union president shouldn't even entertain the idea of a meeting. That shouldn't even have been on the table, end quote. We completely agree with Sister Jess Lister. And we also agree with her when she added that she did not support Biden either. Trump and the Republican Party are blatantly anti-worker and anti-union, but the rise of Trumpism and right-wing populism and the prospect of a second Trump presidency are the result of Biden and the Democratic Party's betrayals of working people's interests. Both Biden and Trump are representatives of the warmongering billionaire class. We think it is crucial that the labor movement reject both Biden and Trump.
But sadly, the leadership of most unions in the American labor movement have endorsed Joe Biden for president. At least 13 member unions of the AFL-CIO, the largest U.S. labor federation, endorsed Biden in September of last year. As far as we know, most of these union endorsements were not the result of open debate, discussion, and voting among the rank and file. As viewers may have seen in our interview of UAW International Union President Shawn Fain, On Strike asked Fain why the UAW leadership endorsed Biden, who has backed the genocidal war on Gaza at every stage, even though the union is publicly calling for a permanent ceasefire. Fain justifies the UAW endorsement of Biden on the basis of fearing a second Trump presidency. Fain said that if Trump was elected, he would, quote, stand shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu, end quote. There is absolutely no doubt that Trump 2.0 would be horrendous, but these sorts of lesser evil arguments in support of Biden actually take pressure off Biden, when in reality, we need to increase that pressure in order to end the war. Invoking lesser evilism as an argument to vote for Biden turns reality and history on its head.
Both the Democrats and the Republicans are parties of the billionaire class, despite their differences, as Shawn Fain himself talked about. But what Fain doesn't acknowledge is that the Democratic Party, standing primarily for Wall Street and wealthy interests, is precisely what has disenchanted millions of people and created the space for Trumpism and right-wing populism. Let's not forget that Trump's rise was preceded by the right-wing Tea Party movement, which won major gains in the 2010 midterm elections as a consequence of President Obama's selling working people out on multiple fronts. That includes the betrayal on single-payer healthcare, the troop surge in Afghanistan, and record numbers of deportations of working-class and poor immigrants. We're happy to have Joe Sugrue here to help lay out a concrete strategy for what union members watching this should be doing from now until November. Welcome to On Strike, Joe.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back, and looking forward to the discussion.
Good to have you back. Can you tell us, Joe, what it's like, what you're hearing from union members, rank and file union members like yourself about the war in Gaza? Are they talking about the anti-war movement and the involvement of the labor movement in it? And what are they saying about the presidential election?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like a lot of society, rank and file union members around the country are increasingly upset at what's going on in Gaza. I think a lot of union members, especially younger union members, and that's also in my experience, are looking for a way for the labor movement to get involved, which is a really positive step forward. I think that in my experience being in unions, there has sometimes been this argument put forward that unions can't get involved in things that don't have to do with their workplaces.
Right.
And I think that this moment in the anti-war movement and people being upset about the genocidal war in Gaza is actually really changing that for a lot of people. And a lot of these people see that the labor movement does have a role to play. And we want to be a part of that and talk about what politics we put forward. For example, UAW 4811 in University of California workers, they have this rolling strike taking place in support of the encampments that are taking place at the university.
The anti-war encampments.
The anti-war encampments, yep. And I also think that we've seen something we can talk more about, also the National Education Association, later on in the discussion, but the NEA was part of a
and
coalition.
And this is your union?
Mm-hmm. The national, my union that I'm a part of. They were part of a coalition of 200 unions and organizations that signed on to a ceasefire resolution. So there is a lot of momentum taking place in that regard. I also think that rank and file members of the labor movement, like you were both expressing in the introduction to the episode, are really fed up with the Biden administration. And just like with the anti-war movement, that's not all union members. There's all kinds of I would say lies about Biden being the most pro-labor president and all these things, as if he didn't break the railroad strike, which a lot of people are really upset about, and rightfully so. But on the whole, people are upset with the cost of living. People are upset with the broken promises. A lot of younger teachers and younger union members like myself are riddled with student debt, which Biden completely failed to do anything about in reality. I think people are really desperate for a change, but we can talk more about this as well. But like you were talking about in the introduction, I think the fear of Trump is very real for them as well. So it's important to talk about, how we move past that and fight against that lesser evilist argument, basically.
Absolutely. And Joe, you and some of your fellow NEA members put forward a resolution to rescind the National Education Association's endorsement of Biden. Can you tell us a little bit about what that resolution said and why you brought it forward?
Definitely. Just for some brief context, it was actually in April of 2023, right after Biden announced that he was going to run for president, that the NEA president, Becky Pringle, announced on behalf of the 3 million members of NEA, massive union in the country, that we would recommend a vote for Joe Biden. There was no Democratic discussion about this whatsoever. And so that's just completely undemocratic given all the people's mixed feelings right now. We deserve that discussion. What we were putting in the resolution at the Washington Education Association convention that took place in April of this year, of 2024, was a resolution to rescind the Biden endorsement. And we wanted instead to endorse a left, anti-war, pro-working class candidate, all as a part of saying we need a new independent party of the working class that actually represents working people, young people, and the labor movement in a real way. And at this point, I think that we should be voting for Jill Stein in the upcoming election. She has proven to be a strong anti-war candidate with everything going on right now. And also, I agree with a lot of other aspects of her program and what she's fighting for.
So in your resolution, was the motivation for rescinding the endorsement of Biden primarily just the fact that the process to make the endorsement in the first place had been undemocratic? Was it primarily about his support for the war on Gaza? What were the kind of meat of the arguments you made in the resolution?
I think the most important part of the resolution was the political question of rescinding the Biden endorsement and instead pointing towards, left anti-war candidates in a new party. Mm-hmm. The most important first step to that being the rescinding of Biden. Mm-hmm. The Democratic aspect of it is still really important. I'm a rank and file member of the NEA. I don't remember voting on that. The 3 million of us didn't really.
You mean you weren't asked? What do you think about Biden?
No, not at all. No, not at all. And this is unfortunately a common practice in the labor movement that we have to fight against and say we should all be able to have these discussions in a democratic way, regardless of your opinion. But I think our opinions matter as well. And what I was putting forward was rescinding this Biden endorsement. In order for us to actually win a new party of the working class, which I think a lot of people agree with and would say we desperately need. I mean, the introduction laid it out that neither of these candidates and neither of these parties are actually helping working people. So in order to actually fight for a new party of the working class, I think that the labor movement needs to be a part of that. And I think that I'm imagining if 20 or 30 or 40 labor unions across the country started saying, we are no longer going to support Biden, we are no longer going to support Trump, we think we need a new independent party of the working class, that would have a massive impact on not just the labor movement, but the political landscape of the country.
Absolutely. And if all those resources, large unions especially frequently make very sizable donations to presidential candidates.
Collectively, tens of millions of dollars.
Tens of millions. If all of that, momentum and support and then financial resources were instead going towards someone like Jill Stein, an independent anti-war candidate, that would have a really significant impact, I would think.
Definitely. It absolutely would. I don't think we can afford to continue to endorse these people that are actively fighting against our interests. And that's something that's very personal to me as a teacher. And we talked about this in the last episode I was on. And I think to a lot of the teachers who were at the WEA convention or who are part of the NEA, they have seen both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party preside over constant attacks to public education. So why do we continue to support these people? It just doesn't really make sense.
And has this been true? I assume it has, but also under the Biden administration? What has the record of the Biden administration been on public education funding?
So I think that the Democratic Party and Biden, they're not outwardly attacking public education in the same way that maybe some Republican politicians are doing. But the reality of the situation is things are getting tremendously worse in public education, and the Democratic Party is doing absolutely nothing meaningful to stop that. And so the result of that is things continuing to get worse.
Yeah, and billionaires have become richer
Exactly.
under Biden and Trump. Both Biden and Trump have overseen the further enriching of the billionaires and multimillionaires while education, healthcare, housing is grossly underfunded. Right. And in fact, we're also seeing how the Democratic Party is also going beyond that. We've seen the attempt to close down elementary schools in Seattle. We are seeing closures of schools in poor neighborhoods in Chicago, and these school closures are being overseen by the Democrats.
Absolutely. I have 2 children, in the public schools, and it's been, really shocking. Understandably, during the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of disruption to schools, but even afterwards, when we would expect things to have stabilized, we've seen huge class sizes. My youngest child's school has had to close down with no notice because there just weren't enough staff to safely supervise all of the children. Right. So it's very clear, as you said, even if the Democrats aren't sort of overtly talking about their desire to cut funding to public education, me as a parent, you as a teacher, the reality is material. We can see that the resources are just absolutely not there.
Right. I think that it's really important as the labor movement also we take up the question of what should people do in November. And that's why I think we should be voting for Jill Stein as an anti-war alternative. If we are going to be advocating for a new independent party of the working class, which I know Workers' Strike Back also agrees with.
And we clearly need to, given the shambles that everybody's lives are subjected to.
Exactly. And so when we were at the convention, and hopefully we can talk about that more as well, because some of the discussions we had on the floor of the convention were really productive and meaningful and helpful for what we were doing also. One of the first questions that people ask is, so then how are we going to get there? Mm-hmm. So we can't avoid that question. We do have to talk about, in reality, in order for us to build that new party, there are going to have to be individual voters, but also organizations. And some of the most important organizations for the working class are the unions to make that step as well. And we should be honest about that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, which brings us to our next question. Because you've correctly explained how crucial the role of the labor movement is in deciding the course of politics in the United States and the need for a new party, which means concretely in the presidential election year, breaking from Biden and Trump and voting, for example, this year for the anti-war, pro-working class alternative of Jill Stein. Mm-hmm. Tell us what happened in the actual discussion at the Education Association convention.
Sure. So when we first arrived on Thursday evening, before a lot of the whole convention began, there was an address given by somebody close to the president of the NEA, so a pretty high-level person in the union leadership. And she was very, very adamant that we vote for Joe Biden. I think that this...
And had you already submitted your resolution?
Yeah.
So she knew about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm not a mind reader. I don't know if she exactly went through every single thing, but there was a whole committee of people, and I know that the president of the WEA did look at the resolutions before they came, through emails and things like that. So they were aware that we were putting this idea forward. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that what she was really tapping into, and it's worth us discussing more, is a very strong fear of Trump, which is justified. I hate Donald Trump. I think a lot of working class people and union members feel that way as well, because he's a scary person and a scary politician. But the reality is, the more we continue to vote for Democrats, the more we continue to support politicians like Joe Biden who are making things worse for the working class, they are going to look for alternatives. We either have to build an alternative on the left, or they will be moved to the right and vote for people like Trump. And so this is a strategic question for us of not just, what happens in the next six months, although that's important, but how do we build a left that can actually really fight for working class people and also fight against all forms of oppression and things that are important
Right.
to us.
And really what happens in the next few years
Right.
will be determined by things like what we do in the next few months until November.
Right.
And you mentioned people who might be, because they're correctly looking for an alternative because they're disgusted by Biden, the Democrats might be pushed towards Trump. But unfortunately, we know, as Kaylin was saying earlier, he's no friend to working people. But then you also have a whole number of people who are probably not going to vote at all, be turned away from politics, feel that, well, I have no role to play. I have nobody stands for working people, so I'm just going to check out. And
Yeah.
I think putting forward this kind of resolution that you put forward where you're actually showing the alternative, I think is important for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a very popular idea. If a new independent party was actually gaining a lot of traction, I absolutely agree with you. A lot of people who are just checked out from politics altogether would get so excited by that and become energized and involved.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a big factor that we're seeing this year is, as we said in the introduction, I think most voters dislike both Biden and Trump, but there's this fear, there's this kind of pessimism that there is no way to actually fight for and win demands that are actually popular amongst a very broad layer of voters, voters from both parties, things like Medicare for all, $25 an hour minimum wage, free childcare, affordable housing. All of these things are actually extremely popular, but people don't see a way to fight for that. And if there were a party, that was willing to put forward those demands and actually fight for them in a proactive way, I think the groundswell of support for that would be just absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree. And the fighting for it in a proactive way, I think, is really important too, because it wouldn't just be a party where people cast votes and then watch politicians do the rest, but more like the approach that you took in the city council, where it was a movement building approach and you used the council office to build and fortify already existing movements and get people involved and struggle, as opposed to just wanting to get elected.
And where elections were not like career building vanity projects for any individual, but like what we did, where
Right.
our election campaigns themselves were a platform for building
For
a wider
concrete
struggle.
issues.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
Exactly. So you were saying that this representative spokesperson
Yeah.
for NEA president obviously was extremely emphatic about the need to vote for Joe Biden. Can you explain why are they being so emphatic about this?
I think that's a great question and a really important point. If we were to talk about building a new independent party, of course, these union leaders, they don't really want to talk about that because they want to continue on the path of supporting the Democratic Party for all kinds of reasons we can get into. But that's what they want. They are Democrats. However, under enough pressure, they might be willing to concede, yeah, we are open to the idea of having a new party, maybe a Labor Party or something along these lines, but not right now. It's something for the future. And when instead you say, we should vote for Jill Stein and rescind our Biden endorsement, that makes it a very real question that they have to combat with immediately and with fervor, which is what we saw. We were essentially lectured to vote for Joe Biden ahead of any discussion that took place for the rest of the weekend. And another point on this is that the logic of waiting until the next time, first of all, just look at history, look at the last 5, 10, 20, 30 plus years. Look where we are right now. That hasn't worked. And so at a certain point, it's not that we don't also have fear of Trump and the far right, but we need to start building that left alternative now.
And it's precisely when you have the fear of the rise of the right, actually, we should be raising the question.
Yeah.
Right?
The question of how do we fight the far right?
Yeah.
Right.
And like we said in the introduction, under Biden, support for Trump has increased, right? So this strategy of supporting Democrats and endorsing Biden is not working to fight the growth of the far right. So if that is our main concern, and I think it is, the question is, what's an effective strategy to do that? And this strategy of lesser evilism, supporting the Democrats, supporting Biden, is already proven to be ineffective.
Yep, I totally agree with that. And it's also not just about being on the defense of the far right, but also we want to fight for the best living standards for working people. And so building a left alternative, fighting for higher wages, fighting for, public transportation and Medicare for all and affordable, housing, rent-controlled housing, all of these things against all forms of oppression. This is stuff that we want to fight for. And that's what I think the labor movement needs to stand up and fight for. And in turn, I also think that is what continues to push back the far right and get more and more people involved in struggle. So I don't
Not
think we
just
have
being
any,
on the defense, but going on the offensive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think we have any alternative but to do that.
And you talked about how the union leadership responded to your resolution to rescind the Biden endorsement. What did you hear from your fellow rank and file?
For sure. Like I was mentioning earlier, there was a significant layer of people that were so excited that we had brought this forward. It certainly wasn't everyone, especially at an event like this, where a lot of people are used to doing labor activism for decades, and they kind of believe more of what the union leadership is saying, which I don't think that their strategy is working. It's not a personal question, it's a question of what's working and what's not, and I don't think what they're doing is working. I don't think they're actually fighting for working people. So there were definitely some people that didn't really want to vote for our resolution. There were also a lot of people, though, that came up to us and said, this was the most exciting thing that I read before coming here about what we're going to be voting on this weekend.
Wow.
Or I already have a prepared speech to say when we discuss this on the floor and things like that. A lot of people also were, so we set up a table outside of the convention hall, essentially, and we were asking people, did they agree with rescinding the NEA's endorsement of Biden, because NEA has both called for a ceasefire and supports Biden. And we think these things are contradictory. What do you think about that? We got into a lot of great discussions where people agreed. Wasn't everybody, but it was a lot of good people. I also think that it was extremely important because they were then able to bring that idea and the discussions and the fact that there's not just individuals, but a group of us now talking about this in the union to their workplaces back in other places in the state. So it's not just a question of, doing this one time at the convention, but this is an argument and an opportunity for us to continue to build on.
Because this is a statewide convention, right?
Yes. So this was the statewide Washington Education Association convention. So when we finally got the opportunity to vote and discuss our resolution, there were about 750 rank and file members in the room. And the president, in my opinion, used a very undemocratic maneuver to call our resolution unconstitutional. And so we then it was a very intimidating thing for him to do, actually, and we had to challenge that. And while speaking to why we thought we should continue to discuss this, we also wanted to make the best political points still about why we should rescind the Biden endorsement, why we should be fighting for a new party, the failures of the Democratic Party, these kinds of things. And this was totally outrageous. I mean, like we had...
Yeah, why are they calling it unconstitutional? What is unconstitutional about expressing an opinion about whom to endorse?
The union
to
should
endorse.
Yeah.
It's outrageous that they called it unconstitutional. I mean, literally in April of 2023, I woke up one morning and was scrolling on my phone and found out that we had endorsed Joe Biden.
If anything should be unconstitutional and unacceptable, it is the leadership endorsing a candidate without any debate and discussion and vote by the membership.
Right, exactly. And so for us to have this yearly convention and to not have a discussion on the presidential election just seems beyond undemocratic. It's something we do have to fight against. So the resolution didn't win. I think that was a combination of, we actually didn't expect it to win when we went at all, but we did expect to get into good conversations and win a portion of the vote, of course.
And I think you expected maneuvers from the leadership like what they did.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We were definitely anticipating some sort of maneuvers to try and stop this discussion. The most important thing to me were the individual discussions also that we had throughout the whole weekend at our table, where we were passing out copies of our resolution, which we turned into a flyer. We also had we had a petition that people could sign so we could continue to organize and invite to worker strike back meetings and things like this. I think that even if the resolution didn't win, I don't think that was an accurate reflection of the amount of great conversations that we had with rank and file members about why we should be rescinding the Biden endorsement. And that runs the whole spectrum too, of people who already immediately agreed with us, and then also people who liked the idea but weren't sure about it, but then after discussion agreed with us, or after discussion wanted to think about it more. But that's important. That's an important part of this process. We're not going to win over every single person, but we need to be putting the ideas out there. And a number of members even came up to us and thanked us for putting forward that resolution, both after we put it forward in the halls, but also when we were just talking to people. I think a lot of people read that and were very excited that something really meaningful to them about the elections was being put forward.
So that partially answers my next question, but you said that you going into this didn't expect the resolution to win, but you still thought it was important to bring anyway. And I'm sure this is a question that other union members will have who maybe are also angry about their leadership's undemocratic endorsements of Biden and who agree with many of the points you made in the resolution, but are wondering, is it worth it for me to bring this forward if I don't think it will win in my union local? So why did you guys think this was important to do, even though you didn't expect it to win?
That is an extremely important question, and I think it applies to a lot of battles that we oftentimes wage, even without the idea that we're definitely going to win. For one, I think it's just so important that we continue to put these ideas out there because people are hungry for an alternative, and the union leadership, of course, the leaders of the Democratic Party, they're not going to be the ones to spell out how they are going to lose.
Right.
We need to do that. I also think that there had been a number of unions across the country that were also beginning this process. People were very, and still are, excited about the uncommitted movement and the uncommitted mood in society, and we wanted to link up with that and point another way forward for uncommitted through the labor movement. And even if we didn't win, it was really important to go through that process to meet other members of our union who agreed with us, to get them involved in Workers' Strike Back, to continue organizing with them in the future, to hear about what's going on in their districts and have a discussion about how we can all support each other and put forward class struggle strategies to win. And also, it was, I think, a really good example of a resolution that was talking about rescinding the Biden endorsement, but beyond that had a class struggle method and a vision for the future as to how we can actually fight for a new party of the working class. And
fight for a better quality of life, right?
Yeah.
Fight for fully funded public education, better paying jobs, healthcare.
Right, a fighting labor movement, all of these things. And so if we had that experience, we then had essentially a template resolution that we could have other people who agree with us put forward in their union locals or at their conventions or turn into a petition at their workplace and get people to sign on and support. So it wasn't just about, are we going to win or not at our convention? It's that this is an idea, and not just an idea, but an idea in action that we want to put forward in the labor movement and be a part of and get more people involved in, for the months ahead. It's also not just about putting the idea forward. It's about, we do want to rescind the Biden endorsements and for our resolutions to win, but we don't expect that it would win the first time. This is something that we can come back to and keep fighting for within our own union. And we want other members of Workers' Strike Back, or just people watching on strike right now, or people that we talk to after this, to also put forward these resolutions and these ideas in their union. So if anyone is watching that wants to put forward that sort of resolution and needs support and guidance on how to do that and where to even just start, even if you've done nothing in the labor movement before, you're just in a union in your workplace, I really encourage people to reach out to Workers' Strike Back and On Strike and ask for some support doing that.
I think that's so important. We, of course, interviewed Jill Stein on a previous episode of On Strike, and we've talked a lot about the need for a new party and to break with the two parties of big business. And one of the most common things we hear from people is, yes, I agree with you, but, none of these independent candidates are going to win in this election. Or a new party, a new mass party doesn't exist right now. And there's this real hesitancy around, how do we take the first steps, right? These things don't exist yet. There's not a candidate yet who has a realistic shot at winning, so we can't afford to start. And what you and your fellow NEA members did was say, yeah, we don't think this resolution is going to win, but we don't think that that's a reason not to take the first step. And you understand that the process of building momentum has to start somewhere. And at that start, you might not be in a position to win, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't start that process. And if we do it effectively, and if it gets spread, and if people see that example, then it can become stronger and stronger, and at some point could start winning. And I think that's kind of a similar dynamic to this broader task of building a new party.
Absolutely.
It has to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And we have to be the ones to start it. Like
Yeah.
it is started by people, and we are people, and we have to do it. You
in
can't
fact-
wait for others to do it, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you, in relation to all of this, actually, I think another thing that might be useful to explain also is what are these class struggle methods you're talking about? You mentioned class struggle methods, class struggle strategy a few times. Can you explain what that entails?
Sure. Class struggle methods, to me, means having the understanding, while you are doing political organizing, while you are fighting for gains. It starts with the understanding that the interests of the working class and the interests of people in your workplace, of union members, those interests are opposed to the interests of the bosses. So more of a business unionist strategy, as we were talking about in the labor movement, is when people think that the bosses and the workers can come to the table and come up with an agreement that all sides win. And if we look at history and just the divisions in society today, the increased divisions in society today that are actually being pushed by this business unionist approach, that's just not reality. Our interests are different from one another. There's one pie, and we have to fight for a bigger slice of it. So class struggle unionism, to me, then, means, with that in mind, going on the offensive with strategies like door knocking and tabling and raising funds and getting other unions involved in all kinds of struggle, and essentially creating pressure and a political crisis for the establishment where they have to concede to our demands. And it's not going to come from just clever negotiations or going to the bargaining table. It's going to come from withholding our labor.
And it's not about talking to the bosses nicely.
No, it's not about talking to the bosses nicely at all. They don't care how we talk to them.
And let's face it, the bosses are not nice to us.
No, not at all. They're looking for every which way to minimize the amount of power that we have in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And also, what's really important about class struggle tactics is the strike. Mm-hmm. And talking openly about how we have the ability to withhold our labor. And the most important part of that strike is to hurt basically the finances of the ruling class, of the bosses. And that's what they're actually going to listen to. That's
the
not
profits.
The profits.
Mm-hmm.
That's not being nice. That's not coming to the table and saying both sides can win here. That's saying we're going to hurt your profits because we're the ones that actually make it until you give in to our demands.
And just to explain also that the idea of class struggle strategy
Mm-hmm.
and the power of the strike, I think that is a universal idea that applies to the working class under capitalism. And I'm just bringing that up because I think for yourself as a public sector worker, and I used to be a teacher in the public college system, we're not talking about the profits directly of the bosses, but we are talking about institutions and organizations that ultimately have leaderships that have allegiance to the capitalist system as a whole and their interests.
Right.
So all the ideas that you were talking about, they apply regardless of whether, when people are watching this, if you're a public sector union member or a private sector union member, it's the same.
Right. Absolutely.
I was just thinking too, Kshama, when you were a city council member here in Seattle, one thing that we would come up against a lot, you would put forward demands that, your office wanted to fight around, like the $15 an hour minimum wage, like the Amazon tax. And one thing we would hear from a lot of people is, oh, well, I support your demand, but the Democrats on the council aren't going to support it, so we're not going to support your resolution, or we're not going to support your campaign because we don't think it's winnable because the Democrats, the people in power, don't support it. And so just strategically, it doesn't make sense. But your strategy, very openly was not about, as you said, Joe, it's not about sort of negotiations or framing things in a way that they're going to be acceptable to the Democratic establishment. It's about energizing and organizing ordinary people who need these things to, come into City Hall to, put maximum pressure on the political establishment so they're forced to concede even if they don't want to, even if they don't agree. And what you were talking about, Joe, with this resolution, and the fact that, your expectation wasn't necessarily that it would win, but also your audience wasn't the union leadership, right? You know the union leadership are going to oppose this. That's not who you're aiming at. And you're not interested, exactly, in watering down the language of the resolution to make it acceptable to the union leadership.
Right.
That's not a class struggle strategy. Your strategy was make these arguments about the things that rank and file union members need and support, like full funding for public education, better paid jobs, job security, all of these things, and appeal to them to support it and to use our organized power as rank and file union members to put pressure on the leadership. And eventually that's the way we're going to get it through, not by watering down the demands we're putting forward.
Yeah, and it's only in the very rare instance where you have a leadership of a union that's also a militant fighting leadership on the left, and we have some examples like that, like Paula Lukacic, who represents many of the workers at the University of Washington, whom we've all fought alongside, where she herself was part of the fight back against the establishment to win $15 an hour and many other victories. But unfortunately, for the most part, what we see is the leadership of the labor movement that is tied at the hip with the Democratic Party, and also very, very tied to the strategy of business unionism, which is constantly trying to find negotiating path or some kind of peace with the bosses, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector.
Right. Another thing about all this is I think that it's so important that an increased number of working class people, and especially young people, are looking to the labor movement as a way forward for struggle. And union favorability right now is, I think it's at its highest since the 1970s or something along those lines, 1960. I don't remember the exact statistic. But the point is, the audience for our resolution and for fighting for to rescind the Biden endorsement and all of the other demands that you were describing, it was not just for people in the labor movement, but it's for the broader working class who are looking to the labor movement for a way forward. And we
like
see
you
that
said,
with
increasingly young people and students. That's the case too.
I mean, what about the hundreds of thousands of people who voted uncommitted because they have no faith in Biden? Right. The student encampments that are going on, and those students who are looking for a real concrete way forward to continue this anti-war movement. And I think that the labor movement has a big role to play in that, and people are really open to that idea right now. So it does us no favors to not take up this fight and to not be really concrete about what are the next steps that need to take place so that we actually can fight for the working class, we can win these gains, we can put pressure on the establishment to end the war in Gaza, and also we can, ultimately be fighting for organizations like a Party of the Working Class that represent our interests.
I was actually at the UW campus talking with students during the encampment, and this was something that came up many times from the students themselves. This idea that we need the labor movement to get involved. We need workers on our campus to get involved, that's going to be necessary in order to, build enough strength and momentum in the anti-war movement to actually, have an impact on Biden and those in power. And in fact, I had discussions with a number of students about, do you think that unions who have already endorsed Biden should be rescinding their endorsements, because doesn't it undermine what you guys are trying to do here if those endorsements have already been made? And then, what's the pressure on Biden to actually end military aid? And that was extremely popular. I don't think I talked to a single student who disagreed that is something that they would like to see workers doing and union members doing.
Yeah, and these movements support each other in that exact kind of way. When we actually went to the Washington Education Association convention and had this resolution and all these things, that was actually only a few days before the Columbia University encampments started and all these encampments started. But I'd like to think that if it was happening during those encampments, it would have just been another argument as to why we need to support this. And young people want the labor movement to take a lead on this.
They really
do. Anyone who does want to take up this resolution in their own workplace, we should also talk about how they can link up with the student movement and the anti-war movement that's happening at schools and universities too.
I think it's really important that you're bringing forward a concrete idea that union members can use in order to build at least the beginnings of the fight back against Biden and Trump and the same old of Republicans and Democrats on offer, while the cost of living goes sky high and the war on Gaza keeps going. And so if we really are looking for a strategy out of the cost of living crisis, for better living standards, to end the war in Gaza, to end the U.S. military aid to Israel, then we need concrete ways forward. And fighting for a Rescind Biden endorsement resolutions in your union is one thing. Mm-hmm. What comes after that? What else can union members and working people, whether they have a union or not, what can we do heading into the November election?
I think that we need to meet at the DNC. I think that we need to point to the DNC as an opportunity for workers to get organized with each other, to share these experiences and these ideas, and to get involved. I mean, I will be there as I'm a socialist and I want to put forward revolutionary socialist ideas, but I will also be there as a member of Workers Strike Back. There's going to be mass protests there, and we want to be a part of those protests, building this pressure, talking to other working people and students, linking up these movements and pointing real ways forward for us to fight for working people. And that is not through the Democratic Party, but the DNC will be an important flashpoint to meet. There will be mass rallies and protests, and there's going to be a Workers Strike Back mass rally that I really encourage people to attend. I'm going to be there as a Workers Strike Back member and also as a socialist, as a revolutionary, to talk about the ways forward.
And just last but not least, in your union itself, at the convention, the state convention, when you put forward the Rescind Biden endorsement, you were there obviously as a rank and file member of the National Education Association and the State Education Association, but also as a Workers Strike Back member. Can you talk about how, and if at all, Workers Strike Back as a national organization, national movement, has been useful to you in your own work as a union member?
Absolutely. I even think the title, Workers Strike Back, immediately people are like, what is that? Like, oh, it actually sounds like something inspiring and combative, and I'm interested in that. So we had our Workers Strike Back petitions with our 5 main demands on it that people were really excited about. Free healthcare and affordable housing for all, against all forms of oppression, a $25 minimum wage, good union jobs for all, and no more sellouts. We want an independent party, a party that actually represents working class needs and young people's needs. So people were really excited about all of these things. And they also were excited. We had a flyer building for our May Workers Strike Back meeting that was taking place in Seattle at the University of Washington about the upcoming Boeing contract negotiations and what the workers are doing there. People were excited about that because they're just interested in the labor movement in general, but a lot of people at this convention understandably had friends and family and other people that they know who work for Boeing, and were excited to see an organization putting forward a real fight back for those workers as well. When we spoke to the resolution, we also introduced as Workers Strike Back members so that if people came up to us afterwards, they were already familiar with the organization, at least its name.
And we had, of course, a recent episode of On Strike on the safety crisis in the airline industry. And Boeing has been in headlines nationally and even internationally a lot recently. So I imagine even people who don't have friends or family members who work there, which is a lot of people in this region, are still familiar with it. And I've talked to so many people who've said, after seeing all of those headlines about, doors and plane parts falling off in midair, they are hesitant to fly anymore. So yeah, I think that's just a great example of the way that Workers Strike Back can talk about these issues that are in popular consciousness, that working people broadly are concerned about, and try to put forward concrete steps in a fighting strategy.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again on Strike, Joe. This has been a really, really useful discussion. I think, thank you, to you and your fellow NEA members for taking that brave step of putting forward a resolution where you knew it was going to provoke really sharp opposition from the union leadership. But as you said, that kind of example is absolutely necessary. And hopefully there are, people watching this show who are interested in seeing that resolution and putting something forward in their own union.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to talking more about, what's happening in the future.
If you've watched On Strike before, you'll know that we provide an analysis from the point of view of working class people about the problems we face in our daily lives under capitalism. In every episode, On Strike also presents a strategy for working class movements to fight back. On Strike talks about why it's crucial that every fight for change emphasizes the need to build working-class solidarity and is linked with organizing a powerful challenge to the political establishment and the capitalist system itself. This is something you won't find on mainstream media. That's why we need your support for On Strike. Subscribe to our On Strike channel on YouTube and like this video, and become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement. By becoming a Workers Strike Back member, you can also help this broadcast. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workerstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Solidarity.